I want to welcome you here to this quiet space we are sharing. Before we begin our journey together, I want to be open with you. To help bring these stories and reflections to life, I use modern tools, including AI, to assist with the voice, the imagery, and the crafting of these words. My goal isn't to present a polished documentary, but to share a heart-to-heart conversation, much like we were sitting on a porch together as the sun starts to hint at the horizon. What I'm about to share is born from my own journey, my own stumbles, and the peace I've found in the quiet. This isn't a universal formula or a scientific lecture, it's just one person's walk with faith. If your path looks different, I truly respect that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments afterward. For many years, I looked at the clock hitting 3 in the morning as a bit of a curse. I'd lay there in the dark, the house so silent you could hear the wood settling in the walls, and I'd feel restless. My mind would start a checklist of every mistake I've made since 1974. I'd look at the ceiling and wonder why sleep was so far away. I used to think it was just my age, or maybe that extra cup of tea I had at supper. But lately, I've started to look at it differently. In my experience, those hours between 3 and 5 in the morning aren't just empty time. I've come to feel that they are an invitation. It's as if the world has finally quieted down enough for a more important signal to get through. When the phone isn't ringing and the television is off, there is a specific kind of stillness. I've found that when I stop fighting the wakefulness and instead lean into it, the darkness doesn't feel so heavy anymore. It feels like a solitary place, much like the ones we read about where Jesus would go to pray before the sun rose. I don't believe it's a coincidence that so many of us find ourselves awake during these watch hours. For me, it has become a time of spiritual inventory. I've stopped asking, "Why can't I sleep?" and started asking, "Lord, what is it we need to talk about?" It's changed my entire outlook on the night. I'm not saying this will happen for everyone, but in my own life, the early morning has shifted from a time of exhaustion to a time of preparation. It's where I gather my strength before the rest of the world wakes up and starts asking things of me. It's a quiet battle, fought in a recliner with a worn blanket over my knees. But the victories I feel in my spirit during those hours are more real to me than anything I achieve during the day. I remember my neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She lived 3 doors down in a small white house with a porch that always smelled like honeysuckle. For years, I'd see her light flicker on in her kitchen window at 3:30 every single morning. One afternoon, while we were both out checking our mailboxes, I asked her if she struggled with the same sleeplessness I did. She chuckled, a soft, dry sound, and told me that for a long time, she fought it like an enemy. She'd tried every herbal tea in the cupboard, and every over-the-counter sleep aid the pharmacy sold, just trying to fix her broken clock. But then, Mrs. Gable told me something I'll never forget. She said, "I realized I wasn't broken, I was being called." She decided to stop viewing those early hours as a medical problem to be cured and started seeing them as a sacred appointment. Instead of tossing and turning in frustration, she'd get up, wrap herself in an old knitted shawl, and sit at her kitchen table. She didn't always have big, eloquent words to say. Sometimes she just sat there in the dark, letting the silence wash over her, acknowledging that God was there in the kitchen with her. Through her, I began to see that what we often call insomnia as we get older might actually be a gift of time. In our younger years, we were so busy running, raising children, chasing careers, keeping up with the lawn, that we barely had a moment to breathe, let alone listen. Now, in the autumn of our lives, the world gives us back these quiet hours. Mrs. Gable found that her anxiety started to lift, not because her problems went away, but because she spent the most peaceful part of her day in conversation with the Creator. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying prayer is a substitute for medical advice if you're struggling with health issues. I can only share how it changed Mrs. Gable's spirit, and eventually, my own. She didn't find a magic cure for her aging body, but she found a deep, unshakable purpose. She became the prayer warrior of our street. While the rest of us were dreaming, she was standing guard for all of us. When I see her light on now, I don't think, poor soul, she can't sleep. I think, thank God, the watchman is awake. It reminds me that our value doesn't end when we retire. Sometimes, our most important work is done in the dark, when no one but heaven is watching. Whenever I sit in the dark now, my mind often wanders back to my father. He was a man of few words, with hands calloused from 40 years at the mill, and a back that carried the weight of providing for 5 children. Back then, I didn't understand his morning routine. I'd wake up as a young boy to get a glass of water, and I'd see the silhouette of him sitting at the small wooden desk in the corner of the living room. There was no lamp on, just the faint, grey light of pre-dawn filtering through the curtains. He'd have his old Bible open, the one with the leather peeling at the edges, and a cold cup of coffee that had long since stopped steaming. He wasn't reciting long prayers or making a scene. He was just there. I remember the specific sound of those thin, onion skin pages rustling as he turned them. To my young mind, it seemed like a lonely way to start a day. But now that I've seen more winters than I have left to go, I realize he was the furthest thing from lonely. He was connecting to his source of power. My father used to say that the first bird to chirp in the morning wasn't just waking up the world, it was thanking God that the night had passed. He believed that if a tiny sparrow could find a reason to sing before it even found its breakfast, then surely a grown man could find a reason to give thanks before the bills and the labor of the day piled up. He didn't have an easy life, and his prayers didn't suddenly make the mill pay more or his joints ache less. But that morning hour gave him a dignity that the world couldn't take away. I try to carry that legacy with me. When I feel that first chill of the 4 a.m. air, I think of him. I realize that I am part of a long line of people who understood that you don't start a fire in the middle of a storm. You start it in the quiet, so it's burning bright when the wind picks up. For me, these hours are a way to honor that tradition. It's not about being holier than anyone else. It's about recognizing that I'm a better man, a kinder neighbor, and a more patient grandfather when I've spent my first hour in the presence of the Almighty. I'm just a son trying to follow the silhouette of a father who knew where the true strength was hidden. I have a niece named Sarah. A few years back, Sarah went through a season where she seemed to lose her way entirely. She stopped calling home, her choices were breaking her mother's heart, and as a family, we felt helpless. We were thousands of miles apart, and words didn't seem to reach her anymore. I remember sitting in my armchair at 4 in the morning, feeling that familiar weight of worry in my chest. I wanted to fix it, I wanted to fly there and pull her out of the fire, but I knew my strength wasn't enough. So, I started doing the only thing I could. I turned those hours of worry into hours of standing in the gap. In my mind, I pictured Sarah. I didn't pray for her to get her act together in a judgmental way. I simply asked that she would feel a sense of peace that would lead her home. I've come to believe that when we pray for our loved ones between 3 and 5 a.m., we are acting as sentinels. While they are sleeping, perhaps even while they are living in ways that hurt them, we are awake, building a hedge of protection around them with our petitions. There is a certain authority that comes with praying in the quiet. I felt like a night watchman guarding a city. I'd mention her name, and then I'd mention the names of my grandkids, one by one. I didn't get a phone call the next day saying a miracle had happened. It wasn't like a movie. But over many months of these early morning vigils, something shifted in me. I stopped being afraid for her, and I started being hopeful for her. My tone when we did finally speak changed from one of anxiety to one of quiet, steady love. Eventually, Sarah did find her footing again. She told me later that during her darkest nights, she often felt a strange, sudden sense of calm, like she wasn't as alone as she thought she was. Now, I don't claim that my prayers were the magic key that changed her life. Life is far more complex than that. But in my experience, those morning hours allowed me to release my grip on her and place her in much more capable hands. It taught me that we are never more useful to our families than when we are on our knees in the dark, fighting battles they don't even know exist. I have an old friend from church named Arthur. He's a man who always has a smile for everyone. But for a long time, I could see a shadow in his eyes. One morning, we happened to meet at a local diner just as it was opening at 5:30. Over a couple of eggs and some buttered toast, he confessed to me that he hadn't slept through the night in nearly 10 years. It wasn't physical pain keeping him up, he said. It was the ghosts of his younger days, the regrets of things he'd said, and the things he'd failed to do for his late wife. Arthur told me that at 4 in the morning, those regrets felt like heavy iron chains wrapped around his chest. He felt he was in a prison of his own making. But he decided to take a leaf out of the book of Paul and Silas. He figured if they could sing praises while shackled in a dark dungeon at midnight, he could at least try to pray in his living room. He started using those hours to face his past, not with shame, but with a plea for grace. He told me, I realized those chains weren't held together by God's judgment, but by my own refusal to let go. As he began to pray during those early hours, he felt a slow, steady loosening of that weight. He didn't hear an audible voice telling him he was forgiven, and his past didn't rewrite itself. But in the silence, he found the strength to forgive himself. He started replacing the "I should have" thoughts with "I am grateful for the mercy I have today." It was a breakthrough that happened in the dark, away from any audience. By the time the sun would hit the trees outside his window, he felt lighter, as if the chains had simply dissolved into the morning mist. I share Arthur's story because I know many of us carry those invisible burdens. We think we have to live with the weight of our old mistakes forever. But in my experience, the early morning is the best time to bring those chains to the Lord. There's no noise to distract you, no ego to protect. It's just you and the truth. I don't believe prayer is a magic wand that deletes our history, but it certainly has a way of breaking the power that history has over our peace. Seeing Arthur now, that shadow in his eyes is gone. He still wakes up early, but now he says he doesn't wake up to face his chains. He wakes up to enjoy his freedom. A few months ago, I was sitting on a bench at the local park, just as the first grey light was touching the duck pond. I like to finish my morning walk there. A young man, probably no older than 25, was sitting at the other end of the bench, looking absolutely exhausted. He had his head in his hand. We struck up a brief, quiet conversation, and he told me he was facing a decision about his career and his family that felt like trying to navigate a ship through a thick fog. He said, "Everything is so loud, I can't even hear my own thoughts." I told him what I've learned about the silence of the early morning. You see, during the day, our minds are bombarded with noise. The news, the opinions of others, the endless pings of the phone. But between 3 and 5 a.m., that noise is muffled. In my experience, that silence isn't empty, it's clarifying. It's like a muddy pond that finally settles until the water is clear enough to see the stones at the bottom. When I pray in that stillness, I find that the answers to my problems don't usually come as a loud thunderclap, but as a gentle, steady leaning in one direction. I suggested to that young man that he try giving his questions to the silence before he gives them to the world. I found that when I bring a difficult decision to my early morning prayer, I often walk away with a sense of discernment. It's not that I've suddenly become a genius, but rather that I've allowed God to filter out the unnecessary panic. The fog doesn't always lift instantly, but you find you have enough light to take just the next step. Now, I don't know what that young man chose to do, and I'm not saying that sitting in the dark will solve every complex problem of modern life. But for me, the clarity I find at 4 a.m. is different from any logic I try to apply at noon. It's a spiritual intuition. It's the peace of knowing that even if I don't have the whole map, I am being led by someone who does. Sometimes the greatest answer God gives us in the early morning isn't a yes or a no, but the quiet strength to keep moving forward. There have been seasons in my life where I felt like my prayers were hitting a brass ceiling. I'd be up at 4 in the morning, pouring my heart out about a mounting debt or a health scare, and the only thing I'd hear back was the hum of the refrigerator. It's a lonely feeling, isn't it? To be awake in the dark, seeking a sign, and finding only more silence. I'm reminded of Daniel in the scriptures, who prayed for 21 days before an answer arrived. The messenger told him that the prayer was heard from the very first moment, but there was a battle in the spiritual realm that caused the delay. In my experience, those hours between 3 and 5 are often when we feel that spiritual resistance the most. It's easy to believe God is listening when the sun is out and things are going well. But it takes a different kind of faith to keep speaking into the stillness when nothing seems to be changing. I've learned that the delay isn't necessarily a denial. Sometimes the waiting is part of the work. It's during those quiet, unanswered mornings that my faith is actually being tempered like steel in a forge. I think of a friend named Elias who prayed for years for his son to reach out after a bitter argument. Elias spent hundreds of early mornings sitting in his favorite chair, just holding a space for his son in his heart. There were many days Elias wanted to give up, thinking it was all for nothing. But he told me those mornings didn't change my son right away, but they changed the way I waited. I stopped waiting with anger and started waiting with an open door. If you're in a season where you feel like you're talking to an empty room, I want to encourage you. Don't stop. Your persistence in the early morning is a powerful thing. I don't believe there's a magic number of hours you have to clock in before a miracle happens. But I do believe that the act of showing up day after day builds a spiritual stamina that the enemy cannot easily break. I found that often the answer arrives right when I've finally learned to be at peace within the silence itself. The breakthrough usually comes not when I've shouted loud enough, but when I've become quiet enough to hear the whisper that was there all along. I have a dear friend named Bill, a veteran who served more years than he cares to count. We often sit together on his back porch, and one day he told me that his time in the service changed the way he looks at 3 a.m. He said, "In the field, that's when you're most vulnerable, but it's also when the guard has to be the sharpest." He looks at his early morning prayer life as his watch. He doesn't see it as a chore, he sees it as putting on his armor before the day tries to take a swing at him. I've taken that lesson to heart. In my experience, the world doesn't wait for you to have your coffee before it starts throwing challenges your way. By the time the news is on and the phone starts buzzing, you're already in the thick of it. But when I spend those hours between 3 and 5 with the Lord, I feel like I'm equipping myself. I'm dressing my spirit in patience, wrapping my heart in kindness, and bracing my mind with truth. It's like Bill says, you don't wait for the battle to start before you look for your helmet. I've noticed that on the days when I skip this morning watch, I'm much more easily shaken. A rude comment at the grocery store or a bit of bad news on the radio can throw my whole spirit off balance. But when I've spent that quiet time in prayer, I have a different kind of authority. I'm not reacting to the world, I'm walking through it with a shield. It's not about being tough in my own strength, but about being anchored in something much larger than myself. I want to be clear, I don't believe that praying early gives me a shield of invincibility where nothing bad will happen. Life still has its thorns, but I do feel that it changes my capacity to handle those thorns without being pierced to the soul. For me, these hours are about spiritual discipline. It's a quiet, steady commitment to say, Lord, I am standing guard over my peace today. When I see the sun finally start to peek through the blinds, I don't feel tired from being awake, I feel ready. I've put on the armor of the light, and I can face whatever the daylight brings with a steady hand and a calm heart. I remember a conversation I had with a woman named Elena. She had spent over 30 years working as a hospice nurse, sitting with people in those final, quiet hours of the night. She told me once that there is a profound shift that happens right as the darkness begins to fade into gray. She called it the sunrise of the soul. She observed that many of her patients, after a night of restlessness or pain, would find a sudden, deep sense of peace right as the first light touched the window pane. It was as if the struggle of the night had finally given way to a quiet surrender. I've felt that same shift in my own living room. After an hour or two of heavy intercession, praying for my children, wrestling with my own worries, or simply sitting in the silence, there comes a moment where the atmosphere changes. The shadows in the corners of the room don't look so deep anymore. The birds start their first tentative notes. In my experience, this is the most beautiful part of the morning. It's the moment where the weight of the battle is lifted and you realize that you've made it through the night. I've come to see this as a metaphor for our spiritual lives. We all go through night seasons, times of grief, uncertainty, or feeling abandoned in the dark. But those hours I spend between 3 and 5 remind me that the light is always, inevitably, on its way. I don't believe that prayer forces the sun to rise any faster, but it certainly prepares my eyes to see it when it does. Elena told me she believed that those who spent their lives in prayer had a different way of looking at the dawn. They didn't just see a new day, they saw a new mercy. For me, the sunrise is the amen to my morning prayer. It's the physical reminder that God is still in control of the orbits of the stars and the rising of the sun. If He can bring the light back to the world every single morning without fail, then surely He can bring light back into my small, personal struggles. I've found that the peace I carry out of that dark room and into the breakfast nook is a peace that the world didn't give me and the world can't take away. It's a quiet hope that says, I was here in the dark, and I am still here to see the light. As we come to the end of our time together, I want to thank you for sitting with me in this quiet space. My hope is that these stories haven't felt like a lecture, but like a shared cup of coffee between friends. I don't pretend to have all the answers, and I certainly don't believe that my way is the only way to walk with the Lord. I'm just a traveler who found a bit of refreshing water in the early morning hours and wanted to point the way for anyone else who might be thirsty. If you find yourself awake tonight, staring at the shadows on the wall between 3 and 5, I have a gentle suggestion, not a rule, but just something from my heart to yours. Try leaning into that wakefulness for the next 7 days. In many traditions, 7 is a number that signifies a complete cycle, a dedicated period of time. Don't worry about having the right words or being a prayer warrior. Just get out of bed, find a comfortable chair, and offer that time to God. You might find, as I did, that the enemy of sleeplessness starts to look a lot like a friend who is inviting you to a private conversation. In my experience, the world is going to be just as loud and demanding tomorrow as it was today. But you don't have to be. You can choose to meet the day from a place of quiet victory rather than a place of tired defeat. I've found that when I give God the first fruits of my consciousness, the rest of my day seems to fall into a more graceful rhythm. It doesn't mean life gets easy, but it means I am no longer walking alone. I'll leave you with this thought. The darkness of the early morning is not a void to be feared. It is a canvas where God is waiting to paint the first light of hope in your soul. I don't know what battles you are facing or what chains you are carrying, but I know that there is a peace that surpasses all understanding, and it is very often found in the silence. May your mornings be filled with that peace, and may you find that you are much stronger, much more loved, and much more guarded than you ever imagined. God bless you, and may you find your own sunrise of the soul very soon.